it was the governance stream one this week. So if you're just joining, this is our July, and it's our governance call today. I've got the agenda up. There's one other piece I wanted to add to this and see if folks were comfortable. There's one profiling topic that I think is governance related around potentially retiring profiles and like making decisions about whether or not we want to continue kind of duplicating content if it exists in IPS. So I'm going to focus on that portion instead of just the I think there was another modeling question around the generic observation profile. And then there is a secondary question around kind of like evaluating like the guide publishing process that I think folks had started to talk about 2 weeks ago on the governance call. And that it made sense to kind of try to say, here's where we're at. Here's what we think are next steps to help us better assess what our options would be in terms of the publishing methodology that we want to follow. And try to identify, you know, if there are pros and cons that we want to kind of delve into more. And so, like, I think that should keep the conversation going from the topic from 2 weeks ago. But I wanted to make sure if there was other things that we want to make sure are on the agenda today, we get them on. You folks can see my agenda screen, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Does that make sense as an approach? Or are there other things that we want to make sure we touch on? All right. So just as a recap, like both our governance and our profiling have been very focused around, you know, just trying to get the 1.2 update out, which is changes to the profiles that would be considered kind of more major changes, but are necessary to resolve kind of major errors that we've had, prep that we want to complete to prepare for ultimately a 2.0 release. And that we know that as part of the 2.0 release, that will also include like canonical changes that we've been discussing for quite a while, and that kind of overall QA cleanup. And so our profiling stream has been very focused on, can we just make the decisions that allow for us to make the changes and get to 1.2 and then to get to 2.0. And on our governance stream, we've been kind of focused on one, deciding like what makes the cut of one versus the other, but also setting up the what can we expect should be our process when we actually go to publish the guide for the first time. So, you know, do we want to have a landing page? What does it look like? You know, decisions about, you know, ultimately, you know, how much time we need to actually prepare folks around the updates and communication in terms of allowing for them to I should say communication and education around choosing the version that you want to continue utilizing in your implementation and preparing for the cutover. So one of the items that I've got, like I want to return to in a little bit is actually around the process itself, because I think for me, I'm still feeling a little bit fuzzy on like what we want to do as a decision moving forward. And I think the only way we can get an answer on what our publishing mechanisms that we want to pursue is by getting all the facts that we can and evaluating them as a group. I saw Elliot had joined. I know we'll probably kind of come back to this in the second part of the topic, but Elliot, I think one of the things that you had mentioned is, you know, you walked the group about 2 weeks through the process of using the Go Publish function of IG Publisher. And that there were some hangups and some challenges with like recent updates that have been happening in the tooling. I know when we talked, you know, there was a goal to kind of, at least from a forum perspective, kind of give folks just that update of like, here is the process when it's working, you know, as it's desired. But that ultimately, I think it drove some larger questions that the community has around like, how do we prepare for having stability in our tools when it comes down to like the week or 2 weeks ahead of the time for publishing? So like, do folks want to start here, or do you want to do like the easier topic first, which is our question around duplicative profiles?
Are you sure it's easier?
Okay, I'll expose that. I think you guys might have looked at this last week with Mike. So
no, we did.
You didn't? You okay?
No.
So this is like one of the, as we're kind of preparing for cleanup, I started to look at some of the errors that were coming out of the QA file and, you know, trying to kind of compare where some of those errors are coming from. And like one of the kind of original kind of, I think it was an error or warning that we were seeing was around the smoking status profile. And in looking at it and then trying to see, oh, well, did we inherit this from the parent? Did we inherit this from IPS? I started to actually notice that we've kind of become out of sync with IPS over time. And so on the left-hand side, I wanted to kind of prompt, like, this is our current smoking status profile. And at the time, like, that we started, we had an initial look at what was available, I think, in US Core and what was starting to be developed in IPS. But IPS really hadn't formalized FHIR profiles that we were looking at 4 or 5 years ago. At least we weren't looking at them 4 or 5 years ago. And so there's sorry, was there a comment?
No, that was a sneeze, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Bless you.
I didn't get to the microphone quick enough.
So like, that's why some things kind of look similar, because if you think about it, like they kind of shared this parent, but we really haven't given the smoking status one a lot of love over the years, right? So like the world has kind of evolved, the profiles have evolved as people have started using them, and differences like that we allow for, you know, where IPS says, okay, you have to have this kind of effective in place, but you can send a data absent reason, and trying to promote like the harmonization of systems to support this particular element. What we had in place with the baseline was essentially an invariant that says, you know, you should either have effective or issued. And so the underlying like original cause for this that had come up was really more of just like a mechanical, we needed to improve where these were being applied. But it drove the larger conversation of, you know, do we want to maintain these differences, and what are the impacts of doing so in a national based profile, or, you know, and if we don't want to maintain those differences. So in the baseline, the way I read this is actually, this is more flexible than the smoking status profile in IPS. And if we don't want to maintain that degree of difference, you know, do we have a reason for having effectively a base that is otherwise duplicative of these rules? So I think it's broken up into 2 questions. The first is, do we have a reason to kind of maintain this kind of older flexibility when we are already seeing IPS and PSCA really drive towards get systems to populate effective if you're going to be talking about smoking status? Lorianne, I see your hand raised.
Okay, so I'm not convinced that we necessarily need to keep the baseline smoking status profile, but to take it back to first principles, the baseline profiles should be broader and more flexible than any specific use case, right?
Yep.
So it's sort of expected that a specific use case like IPS might be more constrained. And so the question about out of alignment with patient summary, I think is backwards. It's the question is patient summary in line with the base? And do we need to make sure the base supports both patient summary and any other use cases if we keep it? Now, smoking status is a fairly specific kind of observation for base, which is sort of why I said I'm not necessarily sure we need to keep it. And I don't think at this stage patient summary is directly conforming to the baseline. They may be conforming in spirit, but not computably. Is that correct?
So you mean in terms of like patient summary in IPS and PSCA meets and exceeds the rules of the baseline?
Yes, but that's done not necessarily by specifically referencing the baseline package, but by human
it's not reprofiled from baseline.
Yeah.
But and you know, I think in the last year or two we've been clear, like particularly when there is a use case profile that is established, like IPS, that like reprofiling from the more specific use case one instead of your base or your core is usually what's being recommended in like the IPA, IPS space.
Well, it depends because there might be use cases about smoking status that have nothing to do with IPS, right? That I don't think anybody's actually using this baseline profile, but there could be other uses that are not part of IPS, and so the broader profile might still be useful. I don't know, but first principles is that the baseline should be broader than IPS, and I don't think we should be specifically constraining the baseline to match a use case, other than making sure we're open enough to support the use case. I think it's the other way around.
So how do we evaluate that with smoking status though, right? Because it is so specific. It is this kind of thing where, at least in the IPS, it's basically saying what we want to do is we want to harmonize folks, how they're capturing smoking status and like making it available for a number of uses, right? Summarizing it as a patient record. How do we, like, I feel like there's a mental jump there, but I don't know how to make it. That it's likely that the rules that are in place here, even though they're framed in this kind of use case perspective, are intended to be rules that are more broad. But how do we evaluate that?
Well, I have a little bit of trouble with the intended to be used that are rules that are more broad. Because if we intended to be rules that are more broad, they shouldn't be in a specific use case implementation guide.
I don't think that there's a universal realm profile for smoking status.
No, but we have one. So if we want broad rules, that's one thing. But the rules in IPS are for IPS. I don't think that we should necessarily apply those as meaning a broader guidance than that. I guess one of the questions for me is, why do we have a smoking status profile in the first place, and what was the goal? Because that may be that we're trying to support broader use cases, or it may be that its utility has been eclipsed by the fact that we have IPS. I don't know which the answer is, right?
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think their origin was because we had a US core. So at the time, I think we were using, let me get a published versions. I thought we were using like the 2019 one, 311 or 4. And we basically started with the profiles that were in US core.
Well, US core has smoking status because US CDI does.
Yeah.
But that, and certainly it's a valid starting point, but I don't think that's justification for why we need one necessarily. Right? It may be that we don't need a baseline profile. We need it in the use case implementation guides. I don't know what the business here is. I have no idea. Does anyone remember back to when this was being created? Because I wasn't involved when we were creating all of these.
Predates me.
And the best answer that I can give you is that like there wasn't an intention beyond, can we include any of the profiles that US core has already profiled? And at the time we were pulling from US core. So beyond that, I don't know if there's any reason why it's been maintained in the set of profiles to date. I think we can kind of evaluate what benefit we get from it being in a base. And if we want to continue housing it in 1.2 and 2.0. I think we might also have alcohol use in the baseline. That's another one. I'm going to check before I confirm for sure. No,
If we don't, it would probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have that, and also drug use.
So let's talk about that, Joni, because I think so we don't have it, but let's talk about what benefits we get from the base having these. If they tend to be more use case specific.
Well, the
I think
benefit
it's,
of having
I
a
think
base
it's
of-
useful to have at least one of them as a template, because there's going to be a lot of different things that you could do in this similar manner.
Is that the role of the baseline?
Eh.
So there is benefit for having something if what we want to do is say that across a broad range of use cases, we want to provide consistency about how this concept is captured so that we can do comparisons and we have the broad underlying base profile for those concepts. If that's what we want to do, there's value there. I just don't have a sense of the maturity of the business right now, whether are we being ivory tower about this one? I just don't know.
What the closest parallel that I'm drawing is we don't choose to profile vital signs. There is a heavily modeled profile that already exists for vital sign, like panel and BMI and observation. And in the base, we just point to it. So when we have our artifacts, we say Canadian artifacts and vital signs. We say, this is pointing literally to existing profiles that we pick up directly because they exist in universal realm. They already have a set of expectations that are being promoting harmonization through that scope.
And just as a slide, there's some significant discussions going on improving and maintaining these. But yeah, something like vital signs, it's not Canadian specific, it's not US specific. It's in the base because it's clinically general, right? And that's why we refer to the core spec for vital signs.
And so my thinking is that this has a parallel to our smoking status, unless we have folks that are saying, you know what, I'm doing smoking status today in Canada and I for some reason I just can't meet the IPS and I need a base that is one level higher. I think it's just additional complexity.
Well, again, IPS is for IPS, it's not general.
But if we anticipated that this would be something that would exist in a core or that may have a universal realm profile.
Sure, but I'm not quite sure what the question is here, sorry.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at is so we've got a profile that is highly followed in the universal realm space for tobacco smoking status. It often is done, even though it's coming in a use case or a domain driven guide, the actual data that's being captured is often already in the clinical record. And it's promoting harmonization by how vendors are capturing that at point of care. It enters into our field because it's in this universal realm domain or use case driven guide. And so it isn't as easy as us to say to tie the vital signs and say, oh, it already exists in universal realm, in the base resource. But are we getting anything from keeping it around just because there isn't a equivalent universal realm smoking status?
Well, how different are we from the base observation, I guess?
Let's see. Get to show off my
I
quote.
mean, smoking status is probably much constrained and it doesn't have a lot of the things that observation does.
Yeah, let's take a look. So here, and then let's go to smoking status. Is it?
I saw a tobacco use example there at some point that you flipped by.
Oh yeah, that
Oh,
was
that's the
before.
baseline one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so this one's the baseline one. So we've got a must support on an already one-to-one. So code, so status already one-to-one, code one-to-one, but we apply a must support. Subject, we have a reference to our Canadian baseline profile and we constrain it further. I'm guessing vital signs is the same thing where it's like you actually have a target for this and it's gonna go in subject.
Not necessarily,
No.
but anyway.
And then we've got this conditional rule that says give us effective or give us issued. Shoulds.
I mean, if we want to have something that's generally applicable, it makes more sense to have it in the base than in a use case specific guide. Like you could be asking, does the use case specific guide need a specific profile or should they just reference the baseline?
I want to see if there's an established profile. Let's see, 1 second.
I'm pretty sure there's not.
Device.
There's probably in social determinants of health and other places implementation guides, but not in the core spec.
Is that universal realm or US?
Social determinants of health is US, although we have Canadian social determinants of health group, but
the guide at least today is.
yeah.
So what do folks want to do and how do we want to resolve this? So I think my opinion is if we do like the most harmful approach, at least right now, potentially is by doing nothing. And even though we have a principle of like, we expect to be looser than a use case driven profile, I think if we don't have a reason for being looser on this one, we potentially are driving a lack of harmonization in our Canadian community to international expectations.
Yeah, looser or the same. Go ahead, somebody's speaking up.
I was going to say, I think part of it is, what do we, like, do we envision somebody who is preparing an IPS to simply pull together existing resources? Do we expect them to go through some transform where they might take their smoking status resource and transform it to an IPS smoking status resource? Would they be extracting both the CA baseline, both ACA baseline resource and an IPS resource from a database or other data store that's not having it in a FHIR resource? Like, I think having a bit of an idea of what kind of use cases we need to consider might
help
influence. Yeah.
Now we would hope that an IPS smoking status resource is also a conformant baseline smoking status resource because that they're consistent. It might be more specific or extended, but we would hope that an IPS smoking status is a baseline smoking status, not necessarily the other way around. But
sorry, I thought I'd said CA baseline.
Yeah, and I should have, but I'm looking at IPS.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would anticipate, so are we, Elliot, are you asking about the user behaviors when taking smoking status rules and then applying them when you are going to generate a summary?
Well, I'm saying, yeah, I guess so. Does it matter if the two profiles are incompatible? Does it matter if, um, are we expecting to exchange CA baseline smoking status within Canada? Or, is that the format that we're storing it in, or is that just the format we're transmitting it in? Because I think it changes how important it is for it to be, how loose it can be.
So we always imagined that the rules that were present within the baseline were more for authors than like instances, because the chances would be that there would be a secondary set of rules that came in at the use case level or at like a stricter core level that would influence how the data actually, like, what it looks like at the time of transfer, right? We think about like that applying to practitioner, right? We almost have no must supports in the baseline profiling more on practitioner. That doesn't mean that we would expect an instance for practitioner in Canada to go over the wire with nothing in it. It's more a reflection of when we're telling authors, these are the things that you can say across a bunch of different use cases are going to be consistent. Start with this and know that there's going to be an additional layer of rules that likely layers on. But I think the fear that I have is that like, if somebody's looking at the baseline, so if I play out kind of impact to end users, if someone looks at the baseline, they configure, their EMR system for a primary care set of practices. They say, okay, when I'm capturing smoking status, I'm looking and it looks like the baseline wants me to do either or. I think issued makes more sense for me. So that's where I'm going to apply my mapping, and that field in the EMR I'm entering right here is going to populate issued. When that EMR would go to participate in patient summary or potentially have their data used downstream for patient summary, if they are utilizing issued because they've looked at the baseline and not a more rigid version of a profile on smoking status, there's a chance that it necessitates a transform to be in place, which I don't think is what we want. Unless we had people today that were literally saying, I need to use issued. And that's why they're coming to us from our smoking status perspective and saying, in Canada, I use this and I need to use issued instead.
I mean, does it make more sense that that's just in the PSCA? Does it make sense to be in the baseline? I don't know. And in terms of issued versus effective time, I don't think we've got enough information about how it would be used right now to say one way or the other.
I think in the framework, we're eventually gonna have categories for smoking and tobacco use and some other things that'll end up getting probably translated to the core as well.
Yes, and that could potentially mean that we have baseline, core, and use case specific versions thereof.
I don't think we need smoking in here.
And like, what would you say is the biggest driver behind that feeling?
Um, I think if you are exchanging smoking status, it's because there is a use case for it. And your use case driven profiling will constrain it probably tighter than we would be willing to in the baseline. And so that's probably what you're going to be conformant to anyhow. I don't think we have enough experience to be able to say universally, this is how we want it expressed. And it puts us potentially in a position where we are conflicting with IPS or US core or Canada core or whatever. And so I don't know that we add value by having it.
Does anyone feel strongly against that?
My just thought is the only reason to include it if we do is if we've changed it from like whatever our source is and that we're saying is a level below baseline or wherever baseline is derived from, right? So if we haven't made any changes for what this would be, then we shouldn't have it here.
Well, it's a profile and observation. An observation is a pretty general resource
Yeah.
used for all sorts of things. So, I mean, there are significant constraints relative to observation.
Right. But what I mean is comparing to what are we using as our base for baseline? What is it
Well,
derived
that
from?
would be
Because
the
if
internet.
right, and if that one has a tobacco use profile and we've constrained that, then that would make sense. But if it doesn't, then it probably doesn't belong here because we're not making any changes. So there's no reason for it to be different from this
Well,
original level,
underlying, we're constraining observation, right? There's not a
right? So which is
international
okay.
smoking status profile. So, and the question may be that it might be that it belongs in core supporting the framework more than it belongs in baseline. I think Elliot's right that in having it in baseline is probably not supported by our current knowledge of the business.
Well, it's just
That doesn't mean it will never be.
I just think the it's kind of getting too specific to be baseline when you say tobacco use versus just observation.
Yeah. I think that's the core of Elliot's point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would agree with Elliot.
Do we feel like we still need discussion on it, or, well, actually, so there is well, do we feel we still need a discussion on whether or not we would keep it before we say, bring that to a vote?
Well, you have it in the base, in the PSCA, right?
Yep, and it's in IPS as well.
And it's in IPS, and it's probably gonna be in CA core, not right away, but eventually. So it probably doesn't even need to be in baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going. Is if CA core thinks that there's going to be like, I don't know that we can meaningfully say that there is a universal Canadian approach to this. And so I think leaving it out of baseline makes sense.
Are we ready to call to a vote? Is there anyone that wants to make that motion? Do you want me to try to frame it and
I-
then see if folks are comfortable with it?
So I think I would make a motion to remove, but I think that the mechanism and the timing
Mm-hmm.
need further discussion.
So we want to handle that as a separate motion? Or do you want to talk about the timing first? Or include it as part of the motion? So there's a question
So-
just for others on, is this a 1.2 or 2.0? That's timing. And then there's the mechanism, which I'm guessing, Ellie, that you mean, do we remove it or deprecate it?
Exactly. Yeah. So I would, okay, let's do this. I move that we should remove it pending agreement on an approach to how we will handle removals of such, these kinds of removals. So it doesn't necessarily need to go away right now, but I think it probably should once we figure out how we're going to do that.
Okay, I'll leave this up. You comfortable with that language? Do we want to tweak it before we call to vote? All right. Does anyone want a second? Joni, I heard you in favor. Lorraine, I heard you in favor as well, or what I had interpreted as in favor. Anybody want to second it?
I'll second it, I guess.
Do we need further discussion?
So seeing as how enthusiastic people were about this, and considering we've got a fairly small crowd today,
Yeah, I
Do
wouldn't be adverse to holding this over to next week, although I won't be here next week.
yeah,
That would be in 2 weeks, right?
Well, I mean, it would be next week because that was me that messed up. I'm talking about a
Okay.
profiling thing, but next week is profiling 100%. So am I hearing bring this item up on next week's for a larger vote?
Have more representation because there's kind of a small group today.
Okay, I can do that. Just say pending motion. All right, so we've had some discussion. We'll frame it up next week on 7/26. And then we can also talk, well, do we want to talk about what our options are from a governance perspective? Because this is the governance call, so that we can inform folks next week about what their options might be, or do we want to handle that totally separately? I think in the past, we've let profiling determine whether or not something would be part of the minor and major. But deprecation versus full removal, I think, is also kind of blends the line a little bit more.
Well, there's a governance issue that's the general policy of how we handle that.
Yeah.
And then the specific instance would be, if and when we had a policy that applying that policy would be a profile thing. I mean, it needs more discussion. My current bias is that we deprecate something before we remove it. If we have something that we're pretty confident no one is using, I could be okay with removing too.
In the past, we had an issue with device where I think it was a duplication and we wanted to split it into two. And we had said, we're going to deprecate it. I'd have to look back on our notes to see if we had come up with any specific protocols around evaluating that, but we had said basically because we knew it would be differentiated in the package, but we also wanted to ensure that folks were aware that could have been utilizing the old device profile, that it didn't just disappear. So what I could do, I don't have much confidence, but I can see if I can at least determine the timing for when that occurred and see if I've got any kind of secondary information that we can bring to the next session. Does this make sense? Like removals as a topic for like a more generic topic for a future governance call?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And deprecation be added as a more. Okay. All right. So it wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be, but we at least
It
are.
never is, Sheridan. It never is.
I know, especially I gotta jinx myself. But I 100% don't anticipate, even before we started a call today, that we would be able to really close out this additional topic. But in transitioning to the next topic on the agenda, where we sit right now is in prepping for 2.0, we have an outstanding question of, are we going to try to publish this through IG Publisher, or are we going to try to publish this through Simplifier? Current state is that we host our profiles in Simplifier. We have a project seat in Simplifier for the CA baseline, but we host our implementation guide on essentially like a CI build, non-published version, but using IGP. Elliot, I know one of the things that you brought up is, concerns over some of the fragility sometimes, and like needing to know well in advance if we do choose IGP, which version that we're going to use Go Publish for, and that we've got some stability and have some assurances there. I talked to, and I don't know if this came up 2 weeks ago, I talked to Danielle out of Australia about their processes and like if they've ever run into, similar issues. One of the things that she had said that does help them is like when they go into it, choosing a stable version, like sometimes a little bit of an earlier version of IG Publisher for Go Publish. I don't know if that's an option that was discussed 2 weeks ago that might help with navigating some of that fragility if you know that there's a stable version. But what I really want to get at is like, what else does the baseline community need to know to evaluate these two options? So we've kind of seen part of the process for one of them. We have an understanding of, that they're as an open source free product, like we know that it's never going to be like 100% seamless and without, some bumps. But if we want to bring our recommendation to HL7 Canada for the tooling that we would like to publish with as an HL7 Canada endorsed and promoted and published guide, I think that we have to be objective in this. Is that other folks' sentiment right now, that we feel like we still feel we don't know one way or the other how this is going to land and what we would want?
I would think that normally the first step would be to try to replicate what we're doing now, right? In which case we're hosting and publishing our profiles on Simplifier, but we're pushing an IG published guide to a website, which this case happens to be the international CI build where we have to stop, right? But we replacing that with a Canadian hosting seems to me to be the logical first step. But I don't know. I mean, it certainly is consistent with how people expect to look and find and see the guides.
So we are publishing on Simplifier right now officially.
Yes.
Um,
And then in addition, we're publishing on FHIR.org.
mhm.
Yeah, where is it? Had it up for a second. So this build.fire.org. Now this would change, obviously, but yeah, this is where our implementation guide lives today. So you make a good point, which is folks that have already built some behavior of, okay, I know that if I'm going to look at the guide, this is where I'm going to go look versus the profiles, to try to minimize disruption. So that would be like a pro to evaluate. I'm putting packages here because I actually don't know. Like, I feel like this is an area we have to investigate. Like, I don't know what this will mean if we if we will then package also through the Go Publish tooling and only package through the Go Publish tooling. So I'm going to mark it as something to, for us to probably investigate on the profiling side.
Yeah, the only would be a change to our current behavior, right?
Well, I think once you include your IG in the feeds, it gets sucked into whatever system both Firely and IG Publisher use and becomes available.
Well, and then they end up in the package repository, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the package repository is where people in general go through for packages.
Yeah, so this would be like our packaging behavior, meaning like location, and then also like package frequency. So the
Yeah.
other thing about this is like we actually packet, I mean, we put out in this release eight bug fixes. I think we probably have developed, and part of this is also through troubleshooting and hearing folks utilizing the packages and needing to put in corrections. 15 packages for baseline in the past, which is like, I don't see a lot of people who are publishing through their affiliates that like publish that frequently for bug fixes. But I think it's something we have to investigate. So minor.
But if you look at I mean, this is not a one-to-one example, but if you look at the history of FHIR, there's 3 or 4 releases at least for every 3 or 4 point releases for every major release. You look at it, there's got to be 15 there. So we're not off. Like, I don't know.
And hopefully the tooling, basically, like that would be an indicator that the tooling is needed to prevent us from doing what we want to do. What else do we think we need to investigate in order to like, so I think Lorraine has provided kind of here's a pro for us to consider. And we've got here's something for us to determine and like assess, are there differences between the two tools and our ability to facilitate the like frequentness of our packaging. Is there anything on the stability front, Elliot, that you guys talked about 2 weeks ago that we think we need to like look into more?
I don't know about more. But I think, if we're going to draw up a list of pros and cons, that's one of the factors.
Yes. And generally by default, we're connecting to the current version of the publisher. And I think Sheridan mentioned being specific about what release of the publisher you're going against and when you move to a new one is part of that consideration.
It's part of the consideration. Unfortunately, there is also a tie-in with the terminology server. There's a
Mhm.
tie-in with the templates. I think there's one other. Well, I mean, if we were using it, there's the tie-in to sushi, although that comes along with that version can be controlled locally.
Yes.
But
mean-
there's a couple of other things that all have to be up and running and all have
Yes.
to be on compatible versions in order for it to work. So just pinning to
Yeah,
a
the
specific
dependent- the
IG publisher
dependency-
doesn't.
Yeah, dependency management is not trivial.
Yeah.
Actually, right now, BC's looking at how because currently they're publishing their guides from a GitHub repository onto the ministry GitHub, and getting to the point where they're pushing them into Simplifier is one of the things they're looking at right now. Because, of course, they write all their guides with sushi. So some of those, I think that's a second stage question after we look at what the baseline is doing. What are we doing for other HL7 Canada approved specifications? But
the terminology server had reminded me of something that Australia had mentioned. So one of the things that they've done is we've worked with Graham so that when they go to publish through GoPublish, they have their they have their Australian terminology server, but it has like the actual pointer has had to feed into something in the background of THO or something in the background of the actual publishing suite that like they don't have the same degree of like control over. So they provide, here is the terminology server that I need to be referenced when I go to publish our, AU core V03. I don't think that like, it's an important thing for us to consider, particularly with the recent announcements around our Canadian terminology server. So I think it's like a process step, but I don't actually think it's going to help us evaluate one tool over the other. Is that
So
something that others have heard?
the Australian terminology server is a true FHIR server, right?
Yes.
So I don't think the Canadian one is like a FHIR terminology server. It is a server that hosts terminology.
But they're using Onto server.
Are you,
Right, but I don't
The
think
new
it
one
has.
is.
Big
Yeah.
pardon?
The
new
new
one-
serve. The new one is.
So you can do like real-time validation and things like you can do with a FHIR terminology server?
Well, Onto server is a FHIR terminology server.
I'll put
Now,
the
whether
link
they
on.
expose
My
all those
understanding
capabilities is another question.
My understanding was that they didn't turn that feature on.
Well, yes, that's why I said whether they've exposed everything is another question. But Onto server is a FHIR compliant
Yeah,
terminology.
Onto server can be a FHIR terminology server, or it can be a server that hosts terminology.
From what I understand, they described it as you should be able to use your FHIR to call and get the list of the values for your term, so that you could make the copy in your local system to validate against, rather than validating directly against the server for everything.
Right, so you can download a copy and host it internally and use that for validation, but you can't use the actual server for validation.
Well, I think,
Well, you probably
That's,
could, but it's
yeah, but
it's a
I-
matter of volume.
yeah,
I
I'm
don't
also
think they'll be able to handle
cautious
it.
if we don't have somebody who's actively like, I'm just gonna post the link in the chat. I think we could hem and haw about how it could be, but I'm concerned
Oh,
about.
no, I asked that specific question of InfoWay.
With the most recent beta launch?
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, like even before that, when they were, in the planning stages of it.
But
well, this might be a good question to kind of bring back to them to say, okay, if we were
Yeah.
willing to consider it, here's how we understand it, working with the Go Publish function and to work with their team to determine, do we put something in here or not?
Yeah.
I just put the link in the chat.
yes, and regardless of the answers to those questions, how we interact with the terminology services in the publication process is still a question that needs to be managed.
Okay. Mm. We put in. Into a. I'll just say projects because I think their base uses it too. Okay, so this is kind of like an outstanding question. I'm gonna pull this out because it's outstanding. How else do we get at other questions? Because like, to be honest, like having not gone through a project where we have to do this end to end through IG Publisher, like I don't know what I don't know. So how do we get at this is gonna be the end-to-end process and these are the things that we would need to answer in order to make this happen? Because we have a bit of a runway now, but I don't want to leave it to the last minute. Elliot,
I
in your
think-
interaction with it, was there like is there a decision tree or something that HL7 posts?
Oh, HL7 says use IG Publisher.
Or I mean,
Um,
a process
but-
tree is what I meant.
No. I think looking at redirects, both, from the HL7 Canada website to Simplifier and things like canonical redirects would be something we want to evaluate. The visibility of previous versions would be something we'd want to look at. I think there's also some questions that sort of fall into the business side of things as to, does HL7 Canada want to be dependent on Infoway's funding of Simplifier? Do we want to, be inside that sphere of, Canadian projects, or should we be standalone as this is HL7 Canada content? So I think there's some business political questions there.
And also I think quasi-technical ones too, right? Which is like, well, I suppose the project would still be visible on the Canadian Fire Registry, which is like first and foremost that we don't fall of that, even if we don't publish our guide through it.
Yeah, so, would it show up there? If we move everything to, the new HL7 Canada website and we start publishing only through IG Publisher, what would be on Simplifier? Why would we have content there?
And related conversations about whether we want our material in the international registry, as many do, which is also basically powered by Simplifier.
It is, but it doesn't, that's, I think, a separate process and
It is.
isn't tied in with whether we're publishing our IG through Simplifier.
Correct.
Yeah.
I unfortunately need to drop for another call.
All right, I will save this.
So do I.
Yep, and we will pick up our conversation around the profiling topic later next week. And I will see many of you folks there. Thanks, guys.
Great.
Bye, everybody.